It is July 13th, 2026, and satellite trackers along the southern coast of Iran are still counting the craters. In the last 72 hours, United States Central Command has confirmed strikes on more than 300 Iranian military targets, with the single largest wave, roughly 140 sites, hitting in one night alone. Missile batteries, naval staging points, ammunition depots, coastal radar towers, communications relays, one after another going dark on the same overlapping timeline, as if someone had walked down a hallway of light switches and simply flipped every one of them off before dawn. That is the image to hold onto, because it tells you everything about how this week actually unfolded and almost nothing about how it was described in public. While American aircraft were still in the air completing the third strike package of the week, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament and Tehran's lead negotiator on the ceasefire framework, posted a defiant message online insisting that the days of one-sided arrangements were finished and that Washington would pay a price for breaking its word. It was a bold statement. It also happened to be almost precisely backwards. By the time that message went out, CENTCOM was already executing the strike package that would prove, once again, exactly whose word was actually holding and whose was not. But to understand why that gap between rhetoric and reality has become the defining feature of this conflict, you have to back all the way up, because what happened this week did not begin this week. It began with a piece of paper signed less than a month earlier, a piece of paper that was supposed to end the fighting, and that instead became the very document Iran would be accused of violating within days of putting ink to it. In mid-June, after a brutal stretch of strikes between Israel, the United States, and Iran that had already been running since February, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed what became known as the Islamabad Memorandum. On paper, it was a genuine off-ramp. Iran agreed to guarantee the safe passage of commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz for 60 days. In exchange, the United States agreed to lift its naval blockade and temporarily waive sanctions on Iranian oil exports, allowing Tehran to sell crude again for the first time in months. It was, by the standards of this conflict, an actual deal. Ships could move, oil could flow. A war that had strangled one of the most important choke points on Earth could, in theory, start to breathe again. It lasted less than 3 weeks. By the first week of July, tankers were burning in the strait again. A Qatari-flagged LNG carrier and a Saudi-flagged supertanker were both struck by projectiles within a day of each other, the Qatari vessel catching fire so severely its crew had to evacuate before it could explode. A third commercial vessel was hit less than 24 hours after that. The United States Treasury responded almost immediately, reimposing the sanctions relief it had granted under the memorandum, canceling the license that had allowed Iran to sell oil again. Ghalibaf called the sanctions snapback a violation of the agreement. Washington called the tanker strikes the violation. Both sides were, in a sense, correct, which is exactly the kind of standoff that does not get resolved with statements. It gets resolved with strike packages, and that is precisely what came next. Read that again, because it is the hinge the entire week turns on. Iran had just signed a document promising safe passage through the strait for 60 days. It did not make it 3 weeks before ships were on fire again. This is not a minor technicality buried in a footnote of a ceasefire agreement. It is the single clause the entire arrangement was built around, and it collapsed almost immediately, which tells you something important about the distance between what Tehran's negotiators say in a signed document and what its Revolutionary Guard actually does in open water. So let's talk about where things stood as of this weekend in hard numbers, because the vague version of this story is not the useful one. On the night in question, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship transiting the strait, setting it ablaze and forcing the crew to abandon it. One crew member remains missing. The IRGC then declared it had fired a warning shot at a second vessel attempting what it called an unauthorized route, stopping it dead in the water, and used that as justification to declare the Strait of Hormuz closed outright. CENTCOM's public response was not a diplomatic cable. It was a targeting list. Within hours, American aircraft, warships, and drones began the third major strike wave of the week, hitting approximately 140 targets in a single night, and pushing the week's cumulative total past 300 confirmed sites struck. The scale of that campaign, laid out night by night, shows an operation that escalated deliberately rather than randomly. The first wave of the week hit roughly 80 targets. The second wave, a day later, expanded to about 90, adding air defense systems, coastal surveillance assets, and missile and drone storage facilities to the target list. The third wave, following the tanker attack and the closure declaration, jumped to 140, the broadest and most comprehensive package of the three. Each wave was larger than the one before it. Each wave hit categories of targets the previous wave had left standing. This was not a single punitive gesture. It was a sequenced campaign, and sequencing is the part of this story that tends to get lost in the noise of daily headlines. The rhetoric leading into this latest wave is worth pausing on too, because it shows how quickly the political temperature shifted from cautious diplomacy back to open hostility in the space of a single week. Earlier, President Trump had publicly declared that he considered the ceasefire framework effectively finished and used blunt, unusually harsh language to describe Iran's leadership, calling them erratic and hostile in terms rarely used in official American statements about a government still technically engaged in negotiations. Ghalibaf answered in kind, warning that continued American pressure would only cause Washington to, in his words, sink itself deeper, and insisting that the strait would reopen only on Iranian terms, not under American threats. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's framing of the latest strikes was similarly blunt and stripped of diplomatic hedging. Iran made a choice, and now it is paying for it. None of that leaves much room for the kind of careful, face-saving language that usually accompanies a fragile ceasefire trying to survive its first real test. When both sides abandon the softer diplomatic vocabulary at the same time, it tends to mean one of two things is happening, either an actual permanent rupture, or both governments performing maximum toughness publicly, while quieter channels, the Omani mediation track chief among them, keep working in the background to keep the door open. The evidence so far points toward the second option, since talks between Iran's foreign minister and Oman continued even through the worst of this week's exchanges, but that is a fragile distinction, and it would not take much for the public toughness to become the only remaining reality. Now let's look at what that sequencing actually required, because the platforms involved are not incidental details, they are the message itself. CENTCOM's own released footage showed carrier-based F-18 Super Hornets flying strike sorties at night, F-35s conducting early morning runs, and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers firing vertical launch precision munitions at coastal command posts, radar installations, and communications relays. F-16s were shown loaded with laser and GPS-guided GBU-54 bombs, a munition specifically valuable in contested airspace because of how it behaves when a pilot has to abort a laser-lock mid-engagement. If a fighter is forced to maneuver away from a threat and loses laser contact on the target, a standard laser-guided bomb can go astray. The GBU-54 is built to default to the last confirmed GPS coordinates of that laser spot, meaning the weapon still finds its mark, even if the aircraft delivering it had to break off guidance temporarily to survive. In an environment where Iranian air defenses and man-portable systems are still active, that single design detail is the difference between a strike that lands and one that goes wide. The presence of that specific munition on that specific aircraft, in that specific footage, was not accidental. It was CENTCOM showing its hand deliberately. We can operate in a threat environment and still hit exactly what we aim at. The target categories tell the same story from a different angle. Coastal radar and early warning arrays near key naval installations along Iran's southern coast, including sites close to Jask and other naval facilities positioned to monitor and potentially interdict traffic through the strait, were hit specifically because those are the sensors and communications nodes that give the IRGC the ability to track, target, and threaten shipping in the first place. Fuel depots, antenna arrays large enough to support both maritime tracking and drone command and control. Command posts. This was not indiscriminate bombing. It was a systematic effort to strip away the specific infrastructure Iran would need to make good on its threat to control the waterway, one radar dish and one communications relay at a time. Iran's own response arrived almost entirely in the form of ballistic missiles and drones, launched at Gulf state partners and at positions believed to house American forces, alongside continued use of a reverse-engineered Chinese-derived anti-ship cruise missile system believed to have a range exceeding 100 nautical miles, giving Tehran a standoff capability against shipping and naval targets well beyond the strait itself. But the operational picture undercuts the rhetoric surrounding those launches. A significant share of the ballistic missiles fired this week were intercepted or failed to reach their targets, according to confirmed reporting on the exchanges, even as Iranian state media continued to claim successful hits. That gap between claimed results and confirmed results is not a minor discrepancy. It is the clearest available evidence that Iran is expending a finite magazine of weapons against hardened, defended targets for diminishing returns, while the United States continues to strike Iranian infrastructure with far greater precision and far lower attrition to its own forces. It also helps to understand how far back this actually goes, because the Strait crisis this week is not a standalone flashpoint. It is the latest chapter of a war that has been running in one form or another since February. The roots trace back to the collapse of nuclear negotiations in Geneva and a brutal 12-day air conflict in 2025 that never fully resolved the underlying dispute between Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran over Iran's nuclear program. By February of this year, tensions had escalated to the point that Iran was already signaling it could disrupt the strait if pushed, briefly enforcing a partial closure as a warning shot of its own. In the days before the February strikes actually began, the Joint Chiefs of Staff reportedly warned the White House directly that an American attack on Iran carried a real risk of prompting a full closure of the strait in retaliation. Iran and Saudi Arabia both responded to that risk in the only way available to them at the time, dramatically, increasing oil exports and drawing down storage in the weeks beforehand to reduce their own exposure if the waterway did shut down. War risk insurance premiums on tanker traffic climbed steadily through that period as well, doubling and in some cases tripling per transit costs for the largest vessels months before the current flashpoint even began. In other words, the market had already priced in the possibility of exactly what is happening right now, long before this week's strikes made it the headline story again. That background matters because it shows this is not an isolated escalation that appeared out of nowhere. It is the fourth or fifth time in less than 6 months that the same basic cycle has repeated itself. Iran threatens or partially executes a closure of the strait. The United States responds with strikes intended to reopen it by force. A temporary truce or memorandum gets negotiated, and within weeks, that truce collapses under renewed attacks on shipping. A ceasefire and blockade lifting arrangement in April gave way to renewed hostilities by June. A fresh memorandum signed in mid-June, the same Islamabad framework already discussed, gave way to attacks on shipping again within weeks. Even in between those two documents, Iran briefly closed the strait a second time in late June, citing continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon as the justification, a claim the U.S. military denied applied to any actual violation of the American brokered terms. By late June, the U.S. Navy had already begun asserting a widened shipping route near Oman specifically to demonstrate that Iran did not have unilateral control over the waterway, a direct precursor to the exact standoff playing out again this week. The pattern is the pattern. Threat, strike, temporary paper agreement, violation, repeat. Understanding that cycle is the only way to judge whether this week's strikes represent a genuine turning point or simply the next lap around a track this war has already circled multiple times. The regional response this weekend also deserves attention because Iran's retaliation was not confined to American positions alone, and that regional spillover is its own warning sign. The IRGC claimed retaliatory strikes against Prince Hassan Air Base in Jordan. The United Arab Emirates said its forces responded to missile and drone threats over its own territory. Bahrain activated air raid sirens and ordered residents into shelters. Qatar's Ministry of Defense said it intercepted a missile attack aimed directly at the country. None of those four governments are combatants in the underlying U.S. Iran dispute in any formal sense, yet all four found themselves fielding live threats within the same 72-hour window. That is the clearest illustration available of how a conflict framed publicly as a two-party standoff over a shipping lane is, in practice, a regional crisis with the entire Gulf sitting inside the blast radius. And it is precisely why mediators, not just American or Iranian officials, have been working the phones nonstop trying to get a durable framework back on track before one of those secondary strikes escalates into its own independent crisis. This is where the three simultaneous pressure tracks converge, and it is worth naming all three explicitly because no single one of them explains what is actually happening in the Gulf right now. The first track is financial. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade, on the order of 20 million barrels a day, passing through a channel barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. War risk insurance premiums for tankers transiting the strait have already climbed sharply since the crisis began, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional cost per transit for the largest vessels. The moment Iran attacks a ship or claims the strait is closed, that premium spikes further, and the moment the United States demonstrates it can keep traffic moving anyway, that premium has less justification to stay elevated. Despite Iran's closure declaration, hundreds of commercial vessels have continued transiting the strait this week, and hundreds of millions of barrels of crude have continued moving through it, meaning the practical day-to-day economic reality on the water has diverged sharply from the political claim being made about it in Tehran. It is worth sitting with the financial track a little longer, because the numbers involved are large enough to reshape decisions well beyond the Gulf itself. Roughly a fifth of all the oil moved by sea on the planet passes through this one channel, a corridor so narrow that the shipping lanes on either side leave only a few miles of maneuvering room for vessels the length of several football fields. Any sustained disruption there does not stay a regional story. It becomes a global one within days, showing up in fuel prices from African import terminals to Asian refineries to gas stations in countries that have never had a direct stake in this conflict. Analysts tracking the crisis earlier this year were already asking openly whether crude could push back toward $100 a barrel if the strait genuinely closed for an extended stretch. And while that full scenario has not materialized this time, the elevated insurance premiums alone are functioning as a quiet tax on global trade, absorbed first by shipping companies, then by importers, then eventually by ordinary consumers who will never see a single headline about the Strait of Hormuz, but will notice the price at the pump anyway. That is the mechanism by which a fight over a shipping lane between two governments becomes, indirectly, everyone's problem. The second track is military, and it is the most visible one. The strike, sequencing itself, escalating night over night, degrading Iran's coastal strike infrastructure faster than Iran can rebuild or reposition it. Every radar site destroyed is a blind spot created. Every ammunition depot hit is a future missile that never launches. Every fast attack boat or drone staging area eliminated is one fewer credible threat to shipping the next time a vessel tries to pass. The third track is psychological, and it operates on both populations and decision makers simultaneously. For Iran's leadership, every night of visible, filmed, internationally broadcast strikes against targets they had just declared untouchable is a direct challenge to the credibility of the closure threat itself. A blockade that does not actually stop traffic is not a blockade. It is a claim, and claims that keep getting disproven in real time lose their coercive value fast. For Gulf partners and international shippers, watching hundreds of vessels continue moving through the strait despite the declared closure sends the opposite signal. That the waterway, while dangerous, remains functionally open, which reduces the leverage Iran was counting on when it made the closure declaration in the first place. All three tracks are landing at once, and that simultaneity is the actual mechanism doing the damage to Iran's negotiating position, more than any single strike or any single statement could do on its own. Now let's go inside the decision-making structure on the Iranian side, because the nominal chain of command and the actual operational reality are not the same thing, and that gap matters enormously here. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf holds one of the most powerful political positions in the Islamic Republic as Speaker of Parliament, and he has been Iran's lead voice in negotiations and public messaging throughout this crisis. But the attacks on commercial shipping in the Strait are not being carried out by Iran's parliament or its foreign ministry. They are being carried out by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, a force that answers up its own separate chain of command tied to Iran's supreme leader and the IRGC's own institutional leadership, running in parallel to, and at times in tension with, the elected government's diplomatic track. President Masoud Pezeshkian signed the Islamabad Memorandum as the government's commitment to de-escalation. The IRGC's Navy is the body that broke it days later in open water. That structural split, a negotiating track run by the presidency and parliament, and a military escalation track run by the Revolutionary Guard, is not a side detail. It is arguably the central obstacle to any durable resolution, because it means Iran's public diplomatic commitments and its actual military behavior can diverge sharply without either side of that split necessarily overriding the other. That divergence is exactly what played out with the Islamabad Memorandum's core provision. The agreement's language, in essence, committed Iran to using its best efforts to guarantee safe passage of commercial vessels through the strait for a period of 60 days, in direct exchange for the lifting of the naval blockade and the temporary sanctions waiver on its oil exports. That is not an ambiguous clause open to interpretation. It is about as close to an unconditional commitment as this kind of agreement gets, and it held for under 3 weeks before ships were burning in the water again. When Tehran's negotiators argue that subsequent American strikes represent the actual violation of the ceasefire framework, the sequencing does not support that claim. The tanker attacks came first, the sanctions snapback came second, framed explicitly by Washington as accountability for the tanker attacks. The strike packages came third, following the sanctions dispute and directly following the most recent attack on the Cyprus-flagged container ship. Diplomats have continued trying to salvage the process regardless. Talks between Iran's foreign minister and his Omani counterpart have focused specifically on the strait, and Oman has floated a proposal to manage traffic through 2 separately controlled shipping lanes as a possible framework for de-escalation. But that proposal exists precisely because the current arrangement, an Iranian promise of safe passage, backed by nothing but Tehran's word, has already failed once and cannot simply be reissued as is. So where does that leave the actual strategic picture, stripped of both sides' talking points? Iran's negotiating leverage over the strait is structurally compromised in a way that is difficult to reverse quickly. The core asset Tehran has always held over this waterway is uncertainty, the credible threat that it could close the strait if pushed far enough. The threat only works if closure is genuinely disruptive. Right now, it is not. Hundreds of ships are still moving. The oil is still flowing, just under continuous American naval and air escort rather than under an Iranian guarantee. Every night that pattern continues, the coercive value of an Iranian closure declaration erodes a little further, because the world can see in real time that the declaration and the reality on the water are 2 different things. Meanwhile, the United States has demonstrated an ability to sustain an escalating strike tempo 3 consecutive nights, and growing, without any indication of a resourcing constraint on its own end, while systematically degrading the specific military infrastructure Iran would need to make its threat credible again. That is not a sustainable position for Tehran to hold indefinitely, and multiple diplomatic tracks, from Oman's proposed dual-lane framework to ongoing indirect talks, exist because all parties involved appear to recognize that the current trajectory, if it continues unaltered, ends with Iran holding less leverage than it had before the tanker attacks, not more. None of that means this resolves cleanly or soon. And this is the part that keeps people who track this conflict closely up at night. The risk is not really about whether the United States can continue winning individual strike exchanges, because on the current numbers, it clearly can. The risk is command fragmentation on the Iranian side becoming a source of accidental escalation rather than a source of restraint. A parliament speaker and a president publicly committed to negotiation, running in parallel with a Revolutionary Guard Navy that has demonstrated twice now within a matter of weeks that it will act unilaterally against commercial shipping regardless of what the diplomatic track has agreed to. If that structural split persists, every future round of talks carries the same underlying vulnerability the Islamabad Memorandum already exposed. An agreement can be signed at the negotiating table and broken on the water within days, not because either side necessarily wants war, but because the side signing the paper and the side holding the weapons are not fully the same actors making fully coordinated decisions. There is a second structural risk sitting just beneath that one, and it is less about Iran's internal fractures than about the sheer number of independent actors now capable of triggering the next escalation without either Washington or Tehran directly choosing it. A missile intercepted over Qatar, a drone shot down near a Jordanian airbase, a stray strike that damages the wrong facility in a crowded Gulf shipping lane. Any one of those events could force an immediate response from a government that has, until now, been a bystander absorbing spillover rather than a party actively shaping the war's trajectory. The more nations get pulled into intercepting projectiles meant for someone else, the higher the odds that one of those interceptions goes wrong or gets misread and produces a retaliation nobody planned for at the start of the week. Wars that involve exactly two governments are hard enough to de-escalate deliberately. Wars that have quietly become 5 or 6 party affairs, with several of those parties present only because of geography rather than intent, are substantially harder to walk back on purpose. Because de-escalation requires more than 2 capitals agreeing to stand down. There's also the question of what happens to Iran's actual arsenal if this tempo continues. Military planners assessing the strike so far have suggested the current pace of degradation, if sustained, could meaningfully hollow out Iran's coastal strike capability within a matter of months rather than years. Not through a single knockout blow, but through the same attritional logic playing out radar site by radar site, depot by depot, launcher by launcher. That raises an uncomfortable question for Tehran's leadership. At what point does continuing to trade strikes for a shipping lane it cannot actually close become strategically worse than negotiating from a weaker position now, before more of that capability is gone? There is no public indication yet that Iran's Revolutionary Guard leadership sees it that way, which is itself part of what makes the coming days difficult to predict with any confidence. It is also worth noting what the strike footage deliberately withheld, because the omissions are as telling as what was shown. Several of the released clips blurred out specific target locations and vehicle types entirely, a standard operational security practice meant to avoid handing Iranian forces a roadmap for how to better conceal remaining assets. That kind of selective disclosure is common in modern strike campaigns, but it also means the public record of this week's campaign is necessarily incomplete. What is confirmed, the total target count, the general categories struck, the aircraft and munitions involved, is confirmed with reasonable confidence through official statements and independent geolocation of specific incidents, including a damaged maritime control tower in the port city of Chabahar, verified through video analysis and confirmed by local officials, and a struck railway bridge in northern Iran, hundreds of miles from the strait itself, suggesting the campaign's reach now extends well beyond the immediate naval choke point into broader Iranian infrastructure. What remains unconfirmed is the precise damage assessment on harder targets, the actual remaining depth of Iran's coastal missile and drone inventory, and how much of the IRGC's command and control network has genuinely been severed versus simply displaced elsewhere along the coast. Those unknowns are exactly why cautious framing matters here. The confirmed numbers alone already describe one of the most intense exchanges of this entire war, without needing exaggeration to make the point. There is also a broader pattern worth watching alongside this conflict, because it points to how quickly modern warfare is adapting to consumer technology on entirely separate fronts. Dutch intelligence services recently exposed a Russian cyber operation, in which state-linked hackers compromised civilian internet-connected devices, doorbell cameras, home security systems, and intercom units, positioned along NATO military transport routes in the Netherlands and other European member states, using them for real-time ground surveillance of weapons shipments headed toward Ukraine. No satellites required, no drone overflight required, Just consumer-grade cameras running factory default passwords, repurposed into battlefield intelligence nodes. Dutch officials specifically noted the technique closely mirrors methods reportedly used to track and locate senior Iranian military figures ahead of earlier strikes in this same broader conflict. It is a reminder that the tools shaping this war, and the next one, increasingly sit on ordinary front doors rather than exclusively in military hardware, and that the line between civilian infrastructure and battlefield infrastructure is thinner than most people assume. Back in the Strait itself, the pattern holds for now. The waterway that Iran declared closed remains, in practical terms, open, just not on the terms Tehran wanted, and not without a heavy American military presence enforcing that openness. Roughly 800 commercial vessels have continued transiting the Strait through this latest flare-up, carrying an estimated 400 million barrels of crude, even as Iranian officials continue publicly insisting the channel is shut. The gap between that claim and that number is, in a single comparison, the entire story of this week. So return to that opening image. 140 targets going dark in a single night, a sequence built on 2 nights before it, following a message from Iran's chief negotiator insisting the era of one-sided deals was over, posted at almost the exact moment American aircraft were executing the strike that would prove whose deal was actually one-sided. None of the diplomatic tracks still open. Oman's dual-lane shipping proposal chief among them resolve that underlying question on their own. A negotiated framework for managing traffic through the Strait can reduce the odds of another tanker attack triggering the next round of strikes. But it cannot, by itself, force coordination between Iran's elected government and its Revolutionary Guard Navy, and that coordination gap is the actual mechanism that keeps breaking every agreement reached so far. Whether the next 72 hours bring a fourth strike package, a genuine push back toward the negotiating table through Oman's proposed shipping lane framework, or another attack on a commercial vessel that resets the entire cycle again, depends less on what either government says publicly this week, and more on whether Iran's political leadership can actually bring its own Revolutionary Guard Navy under the same restraint it keeps promising the rest of the world it has already achieved. Until that internal gap closes, every ceasefire signed at a table in Islamabad or Muscat carries the same unresolved question hanging over it. Whose word, exactly, is Iran actually keeping?